one of the issues that Berto raises is 20 years ago, it might have been very controversial if she had been a human character. So how does everyone feel? You said that being transgender has become more acceptable in the last decade or so, but Berto has been around since the late 80s. Do you think it would have been unthinkable at the time to have a transgender video game character who was a human?
I think because it's like it was mentioned in the manual, if I remember correctly, that she was trans, and I feel like that's something you see a lot, and especially the trans community, is this big desire to do research beyond the game itself. Because obviously there's no point when you run into Berto and you run across Berto and Berto says, "You're violating my gender boundaries."
I think it was also safe to say that because no one ever reads the manual, no one knows.
Well, I think what's really interesting is that for anybody who grew up during the 8-bit era, or anybody who knows anything about it, Nintendo was very strict about what you could and couldn't have in video games. I mean, you couldn't even have female characters as enemies in video games back then. But in the manual for Super Mario Bros. 2, it says, he thinks he is a girl, and he spits eggs from his mouth. He'd rather be called Burdette. Now, this coming from Nintendo of America is crazy at that point. And I don't know if they just didn't even realize it when they printed the manual or what, but in the very next version of the game that came out, that statement was completely gone.
Oh, and speaking of you couldn't have a female character as enemies, that brings us to one of my favorite transgender video game characters, Poison from Final Fight, who just recently, thank you, come on, Poison. She just recently became an awesome playable character in Street Fighter Cross Tekken. Thank you, Eric.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to see raise a hand real quick. Who here doesn't know that Poison is transgender? Okay, this is very, very interesting. So
those are the same people who didn't read the manual.
Do you know what panel you had?
So Poison existed originally as a random enemy character in the game Final Fight from Capcom. Side-scrolling beat up. She was just one of numerous enemies. And her existence at that point was very, very meaningless. She was just a random character put in there because they needed more sprites to have as enemies. And 20 years later, she has become one of the most significant and most out there examples of transgender characters in video games. But the question comes up, is she transgender? Because the urban legend goes that she was originally female in Japan, but then Capcom said, wait a minute, people in the West, they don't want to beat up women, so what should we do? So their supposed solution was that, hey, if she used to be a man, then it's okay to hit her. So, yeah, right? No logic there at all. But that was the story that went out. But no matter what her origins are, the unfortunate part is her origins are still kind of clouded. Now, documents have come out that purport to be design documents for Final Fight, where on the bottom of the document it says new half. And new half is a Japanese term used to describe either post-op transsexuals or sometimes pre-op transgender people. So we don't know for sure 100% what Poison was meant to be originally. What we do know is by the time Final Fight hit America over 20 years ago, the character was transgender.
And as you can tell by this complicated debate that's been going on for a while, and it was actually because of this debate that I found out that trans characters even existed in video games. And you have to understand, when I was a kid looking for my escapism, trying to not be in the very bearded body that I had, you know, the idea that this medium that I love so much actually sort of condoned a trans character, even in this bizarre, attenuated, bizarre way, was actually what led me to go into more research. And I think that's why it's important that like mediums, you know, should take out this cause of trying to represent trans people, because it just spreads the word out. And if Poison didn't exist, it might have been that much longer before I found a word for who I was. So go Poison.
And another character whose gender was very ambiguous in her game is Kaine from the very quirky cult title Nier.
And silence, a little too quirky, a little too cold.
Alright, so this is a quirky title that everybody should play just for its quirkiness, but also If you play through the entire story of the game, you would think that Kaine is just a rough and tumble kind of tomboyish girl. But when you play the game through a second time with the New Game Plus mode, there's new text and story added in, which explain that she is intersexual. And you would only know this if you had successfully beaten the game and started up a new one. And she's one of my favorite characters. She's not only really pretty, but she's also really tough.
And to do a redux of our terminology minute before, intersex is not under transgender law. It's the PC word for what used to be called hermaphroditic or hermaphroditism. It's where you're born with, what's the shortest version? It's sort of conflicting biological sex. And her story is really interesting because you don't find out about it until, once again, you do some extra work beyond the game. That's what the New Game Plus is, right?
Yes. And Kaine, she's also very heroic and very tragic, too. And the text that explains her backstory in childhood, she's persecuted by the other children in her small village and ends up being run out of town to live in the wilderness. So it's a very sad story, and I think it would touch a lot of transgender gamers reflecting their own childhood.
And there's an unfortunate amount of rejection from people's families. Folks, when you don't have the families and your kid pops out and goes, trans! You give them a big hug and you deal with it.